All right, let's go ahead and get started. So again, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation titled Low-Code Tools and Decoupled Components, the Best of All Worlds, brought to you by Acquia. I would like to introduce you to our presenter today, Ron Northcutt. Ron is a Director of Developer Advocacy with Acquia. His job is to capture and communicate the best practices and architectures for developers in the field. Before that, he spent about 6 years as a solutions architect and has been a Drupal developer since 4.6.
Drupal 4.6. Yeah.
Thank you. He is a major fan of open source and Drupal and has enjoyed being a member of the community for many years. At this time, let's do a quick sound check for Ron. So if you're able to hear him, let us know.
All righty, can everybody hear me?
You know what? It looks like we're good to go. And at this time, I'd like to pass it off to you, Ron, for the presentation.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, we've got a lot to cover and not a ton of time, so I'm just going to jump right in. What I want to talk about today is low-code tools, decoupled components. And a lot of times when people think about decoupled, whether it's using React or Angular or something else, they think about low-code tools for building out applications. Those things are often thought of as separate things, and actually they're often treated as separate things. What we're going to talk about today is how actually you can have both and actually not only get the best of both worlds, but you can create a whole new source of innovation by following these patterns. So let's take a step back and kind of how we think about this, and let's question some of our assumptions. So one of the things that's really critical here is we're not just talking about technology, we're talking about the mindset itself. The problems that we have in delivering some of the experiences we want to do today are not because of limitations in technology. Often they are due to limitations in how we use them. And one of the things that I found very useful, and we'll talk about this, is moving from the mindset of building an application into the mindset of building a platform. Now, this is something that at Acquia we talk about, and that's this innovation gap. So old ways and old patterns of doing things kind of lead us to do certain things, and we hit a gap. There's a place we just cannot quite cover to get to the modern experience we want. And yet, a lot of us in the industry continue to keep doing this. We keep using new tools in old ways, and then are wondering why we're still not able to achieve some of those ambitious goals that we have set. So the trick is to focus on, instead of building applications, building composable experience platforms. And when you think about building a platform as opposed to an application, the net result is that you end up creating efficiencies in the system that allow you to make better use of your resources, allow you to leverage more of the team, and that's what enables you to unlock some of the power to actually create that innovation. Now, this is a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about today are things that I and Acquia in particular have been saying for a while, but this is not just us. We are hearing this in the industry from analysts and from other experts in the field. So a lot of the key challenges that organizations have today are having a lot of technical debt, having IT or developer heavy implementations, which causes IT to become a bottleneck, which they don't want. Trying to find the balance between being very flexible, but being able to move very quickly. A lot of times those seem like they're opposites. The whole thing about decoupled or headless applications has become supremely popular. And actually it's been very fascinating to kind of watch that popularity spread across the globe, the same way we see all of these kind of next trends and waves in technology spread. We're seeing the same patterns. The trick there is a lot of folks are trying to apply a headless or decoupled application just because they think it's going to solve their problem. They're not necessarily applying it for the right reasons. And so what ends up happening is you're trading one set of problems for another. And it's going completely headless, completely decoupled is a very powerful architecture that has a lot of benefits. However, if you're not aware of what those are, then you could end up putting yourself in a position that you don't want to be. Now, some of the recommendations that have come out of this, a lot of the analysts are now talking about hybrid is the new headless. It's the cool thing. We're going to talk about what hybrid it means. And looking at packaged business capabilities. instead of trying to build out an application with a release of different features, we want to try and package those into these modules or plugins or however you want to call them, so that we can actually not only roll those out and maintain them almost like their own individual pieces, but potentially we can also scale that out across an entire platform. And here's one really big one, is as much as possible, we want to try and give the business user control over the experience. And typically, when you're talking about a web application, a website, an e-commerce site, a lot of times the primary experience is controlled by the marketing team, by the product team, by the digital team. But the creation and implementation of a lot of that is often done by a combination of design and IT. And this can lead to a game of telephone where there's an idea that started, it goes to design, design's pretty good, that goes to IT, it's implemented, and it follows the specs, but it's not quite what was needed. So we have to go through this cycle a few times. What we want to do is we want to empower the business user to have as much control as makes sense. So that instead of having to describe their vision and have someone implement it, they can actually put the pieces together themselves. All of this, when you wrap it all up, is what we would call a composable content platform, assembling or composing content from different components and different pieces of reusable assets all over the place. Now, for those who may not be that familiar with Drupal, Drupal 8+, we're on Drupal 9 right now, has been built from the beginning to be API first. So you can see here about 10 years ago when Drupal 8 was first starting to just be sketched out. It was decided that there was going to be a massive initiative to make it a first-class REST server with a first-class CMS on top. So Drupal 8 was completely re-architected and re-engineered from the ground up. It's all object-oriented. It is no longer a bunch of Drupal-specific code. It builds on libraries and PHP code that's out there, Symfony, Guzzle, some of the best. And then you can see about 6 years ago when Drupal 8 was released, Dries, who's our CTO, he's also the project head for the open source Drupal system, actually came to and was talking about, even at the beginning, that it should be a go-to platform for building decoupled websites. So we have JSON API support in core. GraphQL is available as a series of modules that can be added on. There's a huge ecosystem around that. There's actually a UI-based REST endpoint builder that's also built into core, so you can actually kind of build and assemble your own endpoints to a certain extent. And of course, you can write your own custom stuff. Some of the other things that are coming that are very interesting, there's another community initiative to do decoupled menus. So allowing site builders and content creators to manage menus inside of the CMS, but then have those available and discoverable by those decoupled applications and components. We have recently launched a new distribution called Acquia CMS, and there's plans to kind of create a more opinionated version that's specifically for fully decoupled implementations. And then, of course, we're also moving both at a community level and an Acquia level to more decoupled administration components. So ways that we can improve the admin and site building experience using some of these. We have some of those in place today and more are coming. However, this is all talking a lot about how at its foundational level, Drupal is ready to be a full-fledged enterprise level decoupled application. But again, we're talking about more than that. And you can see on the left side here, we've got some different announcements and some different messages that have been coming out from Acquia and from the community. And then you can see on the right-hand side, you can see some of the wording and the announcements that have been coming out from some of the analysts. Now, I'm not trying to claim that Acquia is telling the analysts what they should say. That's not the case at all. But we do work very closely with them. And there's a lot of back and forth. So we take, Acquia takes a lot of the feedback from the analysts in terms of what the market is looking for, the problems that organizations are having, some of the solutions that they suggest, and we implement on those. I like to think that we also, especially from a technical perspective, do offer some inspiration because we've kind of been ahead of the game for a while now, and we're going to see how all of this goes. Now, this is Dries, as I mentioned earlier. He's the CTO and he's the creator of Drupal and the project lead. And this is kind of the concept that we have working with, and this is what's powering and driving a lot of the capabilities that we've created and that we're continuing to create. So really this idea of a composable web application platform is to take the open source tools like Drupal, package it together with a combination of what's the best stuff that's available in the community, the best additional stuff that Acquia and our platform can power on top of it, focusing on low code to empower those non-business users, right? And then having pre-built connectors into some more of our more advanced tools for data, machine learning, and things like that. So this is kind of the concept of what we have and what we're working towards. And this fills in some of the gaps on what people are trying to accomplish in the field. So let's start to break it down just a little bit more and start talking about what does a composable platform look like. And then we'll talk a little bit more about those components, and we'll get down to some specifics of how you can implement those. When we think about something like a legacy architecture, typically these are things, again, the technology itself may be modern, but the way it's thought of and used is what we mean when we say legacy. Although there can also be organizations on very old technologies as well. But typically these are things that are going to be slow and expensive. And I'm not going to read all of these. These are the same challenges we identified earlier coming from the analysts, but really this is talking about how it makes things slower, how it makes things more expensive, okay? Now, when we idealize some type of composable platform, what we're looking to do is reverse those, right? We want to move faster, we want to make it easier, and we want to get more bang for our buck, right? We want to have a higher return on the investment in the technology itself. So the way that we would want to do that is first we want to have that business user controlled presentation. That means we can leverage more of the team. So IT is less of a bottleneck because some of the day-to-day work, changing templates, changing designs, moving things, assembling them on the page, are things that marketers, site builders, application builders that have these low-code tools, they can use them self-service. So they can do what they need to do. They don't have to put in a ticket and wait for some work to be done and code to be deployed. Because we have this concept of these packaged business capabilities, what that means is that we can actually start to think about this platform being able to roll out kind of cookie cutter turnkey solutions, which if we have the low-code tools can continuously be evolved and adapted. And ultimately with all of the integrations that we have coming into the systems, we want to really provide customers what they're looking for, which is a seamless experience across device, across all of the different channels, and across all the different properties that an organization may manage. Now, the legacy architecture, the more that you use it and the more that you expand upon it, the slower it goes, right? Because you increase in complexity, you increase the tech debt, you increase the maintenance, you increase the support footprint. However, if done properly, it's actually possible when you standardize to scale this up and actually have less support burden and to actually move faster as you get more. We're going to talk about that. Now, this is a really busy slide, so don't worry too much about that. But the thing I want you to take a look at is on the left-hand side, we have some different capabilities or some different roles that might be filled in the organization. The dotted line represents above the dotted line are roles that can be done using low-code tools or some type of UI. Things below the dotted line are things that typically have to be done using the command line or writing code or deploying code. On the right-hand side, you can see kind of like a simplified version of what that legacy architecture looked like. Now, what we want to see in an ideal platform is we want to see the dotted line drop. So here, what you can see is that dotted line has dropped down, and now most of those roles are above the line. So using some of the tools like a DAM with the UI for media management, Site Factory for managing sites at scale, and you can see that Acquia's Site Studio, which is built into Acquia CMS, that's where those low-code tools come from. Now, I should point out that Drupal is arguably one of the original kind of low-code frameworks out there. That's one of the reasons it's always been so popular, is because you can have someone like a site builder, an application builder, go through and do lots of different things, without ever having to touch code. What Site Studio does, which is one of our products, is it actually amplifies that ability and provides even more than what the open source tools provide on their own. Now, you're always going to have developers. You're still going to need your developers. But what happens when you follow this model is that now your developers are spending less time on things above the line. Because of those self-service tools, the individuals in the business organization can take care of themselves. The result is that you typically will be able to deliver the same experience much faster. So with low-code tools, you're going to get there faster and you're going to spend less money. Now, what this means is that we're able to free up those resources to refocus on innovation. And that's how you turn, remember the slides we saw at the beginning, the innovation gap into the innovation opportunity. Doesn't mean that you have to have more money, doesn't mean you have to hire a bunch more people. What it actually means is you change your mindset and how you build things. Now you can deliver faster. You can leverage more of the team that are not developers. Now you can take your developers and have them focus on the higher value things that are more interesting. That would be things like maybe doing some native apps, machine learning, CI/CD, better testing, more integrations with your backend systems, more types of workflow automations. There's all kinds of really great things that can be done once we're able to allow IT to focus on that innovation as opposed to just managing the experience. Now, one thing I'll just say really quickly, this is not just a dream. This is actually the reality of the world, and I have lived through this reality. Before coming over as the developer advocate, I actually managed the demo team in pre-sales, the sales engineers. On that team, which is now led by Dan, so I've updated it, so it no longer says Ron. On that team, we actually had 3 people. And it was very difficult to really innovate because we were constantly just trying to help our sales engineers create the demo sites they needed. What we did is we standardized on this platform, a composable platform mindset. So instead of building our application, which we call Demo Framework, and it's publicly available on Drupal.org, instead of focusing on building the application, we focused on building the platform. So Kevin was focused on managing and maintaining the distribution, the open source code and the packaging, and also managing where the code base was uploaded into Site Factory. The team lead, that was me, now it's Dan, as a primary architect for how all the pieces fit together and worked, managing the sites and permissions, managing the common media, and kind of being like a Scrum PM, looking at the tickets and the requests coming in and deciding whether those were going to be standardized upon or not. And the result of this, by going to this platform, is we actually were able to consolidate a lot of the work that was split across Kevin and Diana into just Kevin. That meant that Diana was now free to take up all of this work that we never had a chance to get to. She actually has a design background, so having her come in and do design work and wireframes for our demos was super helpful. She was able to pick up doing some more of the JavaScript development for building out decoupled components, which was great. And because we have the low-code tools that enable you to manage your components and your themes and your templates all from within the UI, she was able to take that piece on as well. Now, the difference here is that the demo team no longer builds demos. It builds and manages this platform. And the platform is used by the 30-something odd solutions engineers to quickly spin up and customize their applications, whether it's for demos, whether it's for content, or it's decoupled, or it's an e-commerce, or it's going to be for an enterprise site, or if it's going to be a portal, whatever type of flavor that they're going to do. The demo factory, which is our Site Factory instance running our demos, is able to power that for us. So we've seen firsthand internally the difference that we had in the experience. We were able to take the same number of people, and now suddenly we were able to do a lot more work because we were leveraging these tools in the right way. The sales engineers love this because it's faster and easier for them to get the demos. They have far more control than they did before, a lot more options, a lot more things that they can do, and no one's in their way. They can move as quickly as they want. We have fewer support requests and problems that come through. And actually, most of what happens is those solutions engineers are now creating tickets for feedback for things that they want to see added or things that they need to see changed. And then we can evaluate whether or not that makes sense to be embedded in the platform. Through this process, we also came up with a mechanism for allowing the solutions engineers to add and extend by creating their own decoupled components, which they could then pull into their demo site and augment it without ever having to touch the underlying code base. So we've got security, we've got scalability, we've got repeatability. We're taking the same number of resources and actually getting a lot more results out of them. And it's because we're not only because we have the technology, but we're applying the technology with the right mindset to create that composable platform. Okay, so now I've kind of talked about this at a high level. Let's start to dig down a little bit more into what all of this means and how the pieces start to fit together. So I want to go through a few things just to make sure we're on the same page when we talk about some of these. So a traditional CMS or traditional website is something people think about as being very coupled. The front end and the back end are in the same system. Now, this is a very simple architecture. It does often provide the business user control of the experience. That's why these CMSs took off. You know, things like Drupal, Sitecore, WordPress. They're very fast, especially for a very simple experience. The downside is that there can be challenges when you're trying to deliver this content to other channels. That's why Drupal 8 was created on top of that REST framework, because we knew we needed to be able to get that content and data back out. Often, if you want to extend it, there are limited choices in the programming framework that powers the CMS itself, and custom development can sometimes be slow or expensive. You're going to need good people. And again, the challenge is as it gets bigger, it gets more complex. So this is where we saw a lot of people, especially in the last 5-6 years, starting to look more at decoupled CMSs. And this is considered very modern. You take your the actual CMS and that just becomes a back end, and then your front end is completely decoupled. It's completely separate from the CMS. It can be on a totally different language, and it uses the API calls to push and pull data as it needs to. Now, this is really great because you can actually deliver to a lot of different channels really, really fast using the API. Lovely. Because the front end and the back end are separate, you can do the front end in pretty much whatever you like. So you've got a lot more choices when it comes to how you want to build that out. This is really, really flexible. We've seen customers do things, everything from powering Alexa apps to powering the digital signage in the MTA New York with the countdown clocks and everything, to doing digital signs and updates on campuses, to all types of other things, including native applications, decoupled JavaScript web applications, etc. And the good thing about this is that you've got a lot of options for tomorrow, because that API layer means that you can talk to whatever you need to. Now, the problem with this is it starts to get a lot more complex. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. As you try and take a simple decoupled application and bring it up to scale, you have to do more and more to do that properly. You typically have to have a developer required for the experience management piece. That would be building out that decoupled application, whether it was React or Angular or Vue. It can make it really challenging for the content creator to preview or see what the content's going to look like, because it's going to be consumed via the API. So there are ways around that, but it can be difficult. And personalization can sometimes be challenging as well. A lot of the modern personalization tools were built with a web application, a CMS style framework in mind. And trying to do that from a decoupled perspective can sometimes be challenging. But really what this all comes down to is that the business user does not have control of the experience. And that's something they've lost. And we've seen customers and organizations struggle having made that choice. Now, I just want to call this out real quick. When people talk about headless CMS, it's actually a subset of decoupled. The difference is that in a decoupled CMS, you typically have an admin UI that you're providing. In a headless CMS, you typically don't have a user interface. It is all done through API calls. So you would have to create that. But just so that we're so a lot of people use headless and decoupled interchangeably. You can do that and that's fine. Technically, they're a little bit different, but overall, they're pretty similar. Now, up to this point, a lot of people really think that this is it. These are your choices. These are the two options that you have. But as the analysts have pointed out, there is another choice, and that's something that we would call a hybrid CMS or a hybrid decoupled. Now, the cool thing about this is that this can do everything, and Drupal is a perfect example of that. So you still have your content delivery to many channels because you've got that strong API layer. You can support a wider range of languages, especially because you can decouple the application as well as just individual components. You do, if you've done properly, you can use low-code tools, so you have business user control of the experience. This is incredibly flexible. You can actually operate multiple modes at once. So you can have the content is created and displayed through the CMS. At the same time, you can have a completely decoupled or native application, which is consuming and displaying and using that content on the side. You can also go the other direction and have the CMS controls the experience, and then you can have decoupled components that live within that experience, which are able to call out to other systems or even call via the API itself to do things in the front end. And again, you're future ready. Now, the two big cons that we have with this approach, number one is it can be complex to understand. When you have more options and you have more choices, that's intrinsically creating a much more confusing situation, because when the right answer is often, it depends, right? And it's also very, very flexible, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we're following best practices so that we can take advantage of what the hybrid CMS provides without getting ourselves into trouble. And so this is kind of an example of what our platform looks like when you talk about decoupled. So you have our cloud at the bottom. You have Acquia CMS, which is kind of our version of Drupal, which on the green line there is those web services. And then we also offer Node.js hosting, which can power your front end. So then as you can see up at the top, you can have a more traditional web application, which can just be powered directly by the CMS, but it can also use those web services. You could have a native application, so an Android or an iPhone app, an IoT app, something like that, which just consumes directly from the web services. Or you could go fully decoupled JavaScript application, React, Angular, Vue, which is running on Node.js, which is then consuming those web services. So this is kind of what hybrid looks like. And the idea is that you have all of these options from the same system, from the same code base at the same time, and you can power one or more of all of these at the same time. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to go through some of this quite quickly, but I want to talk a little bit about what it looks like from a completely decoupled perspective, what good looks like, and then we'll see how that ties into the hybrid model. So when you start off, a typical person starts off with a fully decoupled application. We'll just assume that it's React for now. Typically, we're looking at client-side rendering. And what that means, for those who may not know, is that the browser calls the server. The server sends back HTML and JavaScript, and then the browser runs the JavaScript to build out the page in the application, and then eventually it's usable. Now, the upside here is it's a very app-like experience, but the downside is it can be a little bit slow because the user has to wait for that work to be done. Typically, this is also called a SPA, or a single page application. And now, sometimes you have to do this. An example we have here is Google Maps. That's a great way to go, but generally it's not what you want. So what you're going to end up doing is you're often going to start to look for things like server-side rendering. So this is where you're going to pull in a Node.js server. And so now when the response goes into Node.js, Node.js is going to potentially have some stuff cached. It's going to actually run some of the JavaScript there at the server, and then it's going to return the rendered HTML to the browser so you get something faster. And then it's going to run any remaining React for the interactive pieces. And then that's going to be the full application. Now, actually, this is kind of a callback to the old ways of doing things like with PHP, ASP, etc. Those are server-side programming languages. And the cool thing is that you can cache some of this stuff. So it's going to be much faster, especially compared to like a SPA. And ultimately, what you want is you want to get as close to STR or static site rendering as possible. That's why we've seen a movement towards things like Gatsby and static site generators, because that's as fast as you can possibly get. Now, when you start to look at this from the static versus the dynamic, functionally for the user, it's very similar. The difference, of course, is that a statically generated site is just going to be stored as files, which can be delivered from CDN instantly, super fast. Anything that is going to break that and have to go back to the server is where you're going to start to get into some type of dynamic server-side rendered experience. You're going to need to have things, your caching is going to get pretty important there, both local as well as server. You're going to have a way to purge that and make sure that the latest information is not getting stale. And that's going to need to push up not only, again, from the local to the server, possibly to something like Varnish and all the way up to the CDN. And so you've got to bubble all that stuff up, which can be challenging. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, the guidelines, generally speaking, if you're going to build a modern application, is number one, you want to front load as much of it as you can. If you can do static, even if it's temporary, that's the best. Server-side rendering is going to be better than client-side rendering most of the time. And so if you have things that don't change very often, that's great because that's easy to cache and you're not going to have to worry about purging. The challenge is when you start to move away from things that are highly cacheable and become more dynamic. Commerce is a really great example. You know, my cart, I can't cache my cart because it's constantly changing and it's unique to only me. So those are places where we're going to have to be really careful if we want to think about performance and scalability. So how do we blend these? We've talked about what hybrid CMS looks like, this idea of a composable platform. We've also now talked about taking a fully decoupled application and kind of the considerations you go through when you build that out. So how do we apply all of those pieces together to create this composable platform? Well, we're going to start off by talking about a PWA. So for those who don't know, a PWA is a progressive web application. And this is kind of a mix between like a website and a decoupled application. The cool thing is that it can do things like you can add it to your home screen on your phone. So it looks and acts kind of like a native app on some devices, but it's not. It's powered by the web. You can do some fun things like have offline cache. So that means that you could, if you were online, you could pull all of the content down, even for pages you hadn't visited yet. And then you could actually interact with those even if you didn't have a signal. And you can do things with that offline cache to provide better interactions that make it feel more native. You can do things like sync offline data. So if you're offline and you're putting in and inputting data, then that can sit in the local until connection is restored and then can be synced back up. So that can give it more of an app-like feel. And you can improve your loading time because your content can be loaded progressively as you need it, as well as dynamically on demand. And so the experience, we're going to talk about an example here in a minute, is you get something very fast and it's almost instantaneous. And ultimately, one of the things that's most interesting about a PWA is it really does help you build cross-platform applications much faster than like a native app. Now, one of the coolest, most popular progressive web apps you're going to see out there is something along the lines of Facebook with React or something like Twitter. And there's some great resources that are available out there where Twitter has talked about why they've chosen to focus so much on a PWA. Now they do have native applications, and that's important, but typically their PWA application is kind of their flagship. First off, it's smaller and it's faster to start using. So a person can go to Twitter immediately and immediately start using it right in their browser without installing anything. They can roll out incremental improvements very quickly and easily, and they have instant deployments. So with a native app or something like that, you have to, ask the user to update, or hopefully they have auto update on. With a web application, when I go to the site, if the cache is clear for the code, I'm just going to get new code. So I can actually ensure that everyone's on the latest and greatest. So everyone's always updated. We can do that incremental download. So when I go and get like a native app or something like that, I've got to download the whole application and then I can start using it. The great thing about a progressive web app is the user only has to download the pieces and the components that they need at that time, and they may never need all of them. So now this is really going to be advantageous when we're talking about mobile devices or users that are perhaps that don't have good access because they're in a more rural environment, or maybe they don't have broadband. We want to think about those users and give them the best experience we can. These are typically much easier to build. So if you're going to be building a native application, you're going to have a lot of expertise, but progressive web apps are written in the language of the web, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and it's much easier to have this standardization at scale. So we're talking about how a progressive web app provides so many advantages for us, and we've talked about all the things you're going to have to do or build or maintain when you're talking about a fully decoupled app. But the thing that's really interesting is that when you're building a fully decoupled application, there's a lot of stuff you're going to have to manage, but Drupal actually already manages that for you. So as a hybrid CMS, you actually get a lot of what you want before you build anything. So you've got the ability for content rendering and the low-code tools. Asset aggregation and dependency management is all built in. Drupal's got an amazing caching layer, and the cache invalidation is very flexible. It's very powerful. It's tag-based as well as time-based, and there's purge integrations that can bubble it all the way up to the CDN. The content data modeling is solid, and so of course you also have the database that goes with it, and you've got the APIs there. So you've got a lot of different outputs that you can do. You've got a lot of pre-built integrations that are set up in the back end, some decoupled tools on the front end. Business user gets control of the experience, and really, if you think about it, this is kind of like what you're ending up with. So when you have a server-side rendered React app, from the browser, from the user's perspective, they're getting HTML, and then they're getting CSS, and they're getting some JavaScript to run on the page, and then they're interacting and doing what they want to do. And Drupal's actually doing the exact same thing. It's rendering and caching and delivering HTML, some JavaScript to run client-side, and then the CSS for the styling. So you get all of this stuff, including multilingual capabilities, good accessibility, and you can actually turn into a progressive web app just by turning on a module. It's pretty much out of the box. So Drupal's actually giving you the same functionality that is available that you're going to have to build, only it's doing it all within the system. Now, remember, as we talked about, we want to limit the amount of client-side rendering that we can. And so when we start looking at integrations and how do we do this, there are two different layers where we can provide an integration. One is the back end, and that's in the CMS itself, and the other is the front end or on the client side. So for anything that's highly cacheable, that could be product data, that could be any type of data from another system. You might have some things that are tied into the CMS from a tracking perspective. That could be done in the CMS at the back end. And that allows you to do things like ensure that the business user has control of the experience over that data and that integration. You can use the caching layer in Drupal. It just works, it's turnkey. And you can push as much as possible into purge, to cache, and use the purge that's built in to let it do what it needs to do. Now, anything that is live, that's transactional, that's personalized, we typically want to do that on the front end so we don't break the cache, right? Because we want this to be performant. And we do this using JavaScript web components and services, whether those are external services or they're the services and the API that's provided by the CMS. Now, we're going to show you here in a minute, you can actually make it so that the business user, that site builder, that content author, they can actually control the configuration and placement of these components. And this is where we get into that kind of hybrid decoupled integration, which is what's going to give us the flexibility we need. Now, as a general rule, we want to limit. We don't want to put everything in the front end if we can help it, because we want to think about performance. But there's also some things that we can do there. We'll come back to that in a minute. So something like this might look like, here's a very standard, typical wireframe of an e-commerce site. And what this might look like is something like this. Everything that you see that's in white is managed by the CMS through the admin interface. The pieces that are blue are personalizations. In this case, could be Acquia personalization. And then the pieces that are pink are your web components. Those are the transactional things. So there's the, my cart, there's my account and login, and my order history. The add to cart and the ability to tie into that is also being done with web components. We've got a great example of this. It's our Acquia Commerce Framework, which is publicly available. You can kind of see how this is done and how we do this in the real world. And then what you see on the side here is that we're actually using Acquia Search, which is a Solr-based search that is part of our hosting platform that you can take advantage of. And then we're using Site Studio, which is those low-code tools, to build out the templates for the products, to build out the templates for the search, for the content, etc. So all of this is really easy and it works really, really well. So how do we do this? How do we get those components and make them available? There's a really great module in Drupal called the component module. And one of the things that it was created for was to make it as easy as possible for a JavaScript developer to get their components into Drupal without having to touch a lot of code, specifically back-end code that they don't know. So in this case, all we need is a single YAML file, something like this, and you'll notice that it defines what the component is, it defines what the assets are, and it defines any other dependencies that need to be loaded with it. In this case, the cart storage library that again is in the Acquia, the ACF or Acquia Commerce Framework Git repo. What this does is those components are then going to be auto-discovered by the system, and they're going to be visible in the UI just like everything else. So just like any other block or piece of content, as far as the site builder, the content creator is aware, these are just tools like anything else. You can use these and assemble them. In this case, you can see one of the views of the low-code tool that allows you to drag and drop the pieces in place. In this case, we're building out the cart page that we're going to see and use. And this is how it renders out. So you can see that the actual cart page itself, that was just going to be cached and delivered from the CDN. But this component for the full cart, which is specific to the user, that's just a web component. The promo code form is a web component. The totals is a web component, shipping, the buttons. These are all just JavaScript web components that are running on the client to do what they need to do. And I can go back in to the admin and I can move and rearrange and add other things, content, components, etc., without having to deploy code. This is why this composable platform experience makes things very, very fast. Now, another interesting thing that we're doing here is we're also able to use the API to not just feed out the JSON data, but we can also feed out HTML snippets. And this works really, really well in a hybrid decoupled mode. So what we're looking at here in the UI for Acquia CMS, you would see a list of different types of templates for your content. In this case, you can see for the product content, we have 7, I think, different templates available, depending on the view. If you wanted to see the full product page versus a card versus a teaser, etc. And one that we have here is this one that's for a list. What that does, you can see, is that we have the, this is the template that is created for that list view mode. So we have the image in one column, in the central column we have the title and the SKU, and then the final column we have the price. This is actually being rendered as HTML snippets and passed out through the API. We've got the rest of the data here. We could build it ourselves, but the advantage in this case is that because we know we're using this within the system, we can actually output this in our cart. So in the full cart, This is a line item for a specific product in the full card. Now, the advantage here is that now, not only can I manage the placement of the full card, I can also manage the template for the product line item from within the UI as well. And this is that idea about having a composable platform. As much as possible, we want to think, how do we make it how do we enable our non-developer, they may be very technical, but how do we enable them to do things without having to deploy code? And these types of approaches are what let us do that very quickly and easily. We're just a few minutes over, so I'm just going to blast through these last ones to get some questions. Here you can see kind of like an overview of what this looks like, right? We've got, we can use Site Factory or Acquia's platform to manage a bunch of different applications. And then the type of application will determine which one is, whether it's using that for content, which is in all cases, or in the case of a traditional or full stack, or in a hybrid case, we're also using that to power the display. And you can see some examples here of what you might use some of these for. And again, this is really important. Not only do we want to take advantage of hybrid to make sure we have all those options, we also want to think about that composable platform concept so that we can ensure that we're building things out to be scalable. Last thing that I'll point out here, that was my last slide, so we're ready to open up for some questions. Acquia does have an annual customer conference called Acquia Engage. It's coming in the end of October. So definitely want to make sure that you know about that. If you're an Acquia customer, you should definitely take part. And I'm very excited because I've got a whole track this year for the developer track. So we're going to be rolling out some new tools. We're going to be telling you about some of the new features. We'll be talking about our new developer portal. Lots and lots of great stuff that's going to be coming out. And so make sure that you get registered, get yourself a front row seat, because there's going to be a lot of great stuff. Awesome. So
Okay.
at this point, let's can we take some questions?
Yeah, let's do some questions. Please make sure that you put your questions in the questions panel for Ron so we can get to them while we still have him alive in front and center. And we'll go ahead and get started with our first question here. And it reads, how much are you seeing this low code and decoupled integration pattern within the field?
That's a good question. We're seeing it more and more. A few years ago, it was the kind of thing that, I'd say probably like 3 or 4 years ago, was the kind of thing that some of us were organizing for customers from a solutions, a professional services level. Since that time, we've started to see more standardization with the approach, the messaging. We definitely are seeing it with things like Acquia Commerce Framework. So we're seeing this more, but there's still a lot of learning and a lot of work we need to do to kind of get the message out. Lots of applications for sure.
It's okay, definitely room to grow, which is always a promising thing. Okay, we've got another question here. Can you talk a little bit how about SSR and SEO for heavy JavaScript component apps, please?
Sure thing. So now, if you'll recall, ideally, we want to limit the number of decoupled components that are run on the client side, because that can slow things down, and you would lose out on SEO sometimes. Depending on the component, it may not be viewed. However, you might also really want to use the hybrid CMS to push most of the experience through those components, assemble them on the page, and that's your progressive web app, which is completely a valid solution. So one of the things that we're working on right now is we actually have a team at Acquia that's working on a reference solution for creating a Node.js middleware layer. And what that does is it will actually proxy the call from the client to the backend, retrieve that progressive web app, and render any of those components that it can before returning them. So that would be the place where you can actually have server-side rendering of JavaScript combined with using the low-code tools to assemble the pieces onto the page. It's very, very interesting. And as we start to see more of that pattern, I think it's going to be a game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely looking forward to seeing that in action. And It looks like we have one final question for you right now, Ron. Can you talk a little about what framework you would recommend for making those JavaScript components in Drupal?
Mhm. So I'm going to risk upsetting folks because I do have an opinion. Personally, I have traditionally liked just vanilla JavaScript web components. You'll see that in the Acquia Commerce framework. So I really like that. I think it's simple and easy. And we do see customers who do things like use React. Vue very popular as well in this modality. One of the issues there is that things like React and Angular and Vue have a lot of extra stuff built into the framework because it expects it's going to have to support that. And so when you're using Drupal as a hybrid CMS, Drupal's providing a bunch of functionality, and you should use as much of it as you can. Let's be honest, right? Let's not reinvent the wheel. So in my experience, a lot of when you move to this model of using low-code tools with decoupled components, sometimes some of the extra functionality that things like React and Angular can provide can really just end up getting in your way. So again, I personally would probably default down to something like vanilla JavaScript. If you're really old school, you could even do something like jQuery. We do have some customers who still love to use jQuery, which is available as well. However, I will say that I've been doing a lot of playing lately with Svelte, SVELTE, and been very, very pleased with how fast and performant and how easy it is. Definitely something, if you haven't heard of Svelte, you should check it out. I actually was working on a project with a Drupal developer who's not a JavaScript dev, and he was able to figure it out in about an hour or so, and within, I'd say, a half a day, he'd already built out his first decoupled component that was pretty advanced, paging, sorting, filtering, displaying cards and all sorts of things. So I'm pretty impressed by Svelte, and I'd like to see broader adoption by the Drupal community itself. So go check it out if you haven't already.
Awesome, good to know. We definitely appreciate the recommendations and your opinions as well. With that, it looks like we do not have any more questions. So Ron, DZone would like to thank you for your phenomenal presentation. DZone would also like to thank Acquia for providing the audience with this great webinar. Lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.